Good morning, friends. I'm sorry that our recording didn't happen this morning. There was another glitch with our equipment, but I'm going to try to give you a little synopsis of what I talked about today. Of course, we're continuing with our global themes and rising higher and growing deeper. And I shared this morning that I definitely feel stretched between my roots and where I want to be consciously and intentionally. Our topic for the month of March is the flow of coming and going, and it's grounded in a beautiful idea about how we continue to move and ebb and flow with all that is happening in the world right now and all that's happening in our lives. And so today I'm going to talk about, and what I talked about was what's going on in the world. And I know that it's been a little dicey for many of us, and lots of people have been very concerned about what's going on in the universe right now, especially our country, and how that impacts the whole world. But I want to talk about it, the relevancy of it as it pertains to our principles. And so the three principles in the what we believe, if you have a Science of Mind magazine right in the front, under the title of We Believe, these are our declarations of principle, and they show up in every issue of our Science of Mind magazine. And the three that jumped out at me are we believe in the eternality, the immortality, and the continuity of the individual soul, forever and ever expanding. The other principle that struck me as I was thinking about this topic and what's going on in the world is that we believe in the healing of the sick and the control of conditions through the power of this mind. And so that first principle talks about the eternality or the immortality of all life. It can never be diminished or destroyed. And then the second principle talks about where we do have agency, that we can control how we move through conditions, whether it's a diagnosis or something that's happening in the world. And so we have the power of not only our mind, but our alignment with spirit to move through conditions. And we have some agency in how we move through them. And then finally, we believe that the universal spirit, which is God, operates through a universal mind, which is the law of God, and that we are surrounded by this creative mind, which receives the direct impress of our thought and acts upon it. And so if we think about those three ideas, the very big ideas of immortality and eternality, of the control of effects that we're experiencing, and then that we're working with this universal mind that is forever creating by means of us and through us, this gives us a place to stand on solid ground. There are a lot of narratives going on right now. And narrative is a fancy word for opinions or stories that we subscribe to. And one of those narratives could be that peace is worth the cost of giving up sovereignty. And another could be that promises were made and should be kept. Or still another could be more relevant for our purposes today, is the exercising of power and aligning with that power. Exercising power and aligning with that power. And so we're seeing in the headlines this discussion, this narrative about shifting power and how aligning with different powers. And yet what I want to share with you is that a lot of that is really egoic power. It's not the power of the one mind, it's the power of the individual trying to exert power over things. And I know that it can make me feel pretty powerless when things aren't going the way I think they should, and especially when they're happening at such a global level. I can be disheartened and emotional and disappointed. I could feel, some people are feeling proud and empowered by what's going on. There's a lot of different narratives with what we're witnessing in the world, but we teach about power, that it lies within us, that it's available to everyone, and that we do have agency. But we're not talking about egoic power. We're talking about aligning ourselves with the power of of spirit, that universal power, the thing that makes the grass grow, is the same power that moves through us, that moves through each one of us individually. And so, while there are power plays happening in the world, our work is to first ground ourselves with spiritual principle before we engage. We have this opportunity to notice that when we really do feel triggered or overly emotional about something, or we're spinning out about something, that this is the invitation to get grounded in spiritual practice and principles. Not because I'm suggesting that we shouldn't take any action, but that we should be grounded before we do anything, before we speak out, before we take any action. If we can ground ourselves in spiritual principle and spiritual practice, we can begin to really find ourselves in a place that is well healed and is authentic to what God wants to express by means of us. And so in this experience of watching what's going on in the global community, we first bring it home. I am doing some work with a community of mentors and mentees, and we had a session yesterday morning, and we're working with a book called Resurrection by Paul Selig, which is very personal to me. And in it, there is this quote that just, with this topic and with what's going on, it just kind of hit me right between the eyes. And the quote is, "What you put in darkness calls you to darkness. What you deny the divine in claims you in that darkness, or at least the shadow of it." And so this quote, and I'm going to read it one more time. What you put in darkness calls you to the darkness. What you deny the divine in claims you in that darkness, or at least the shadow of it. And so this emotional roller coaster that we can get on is really driven by more egoic emotions. And depending on how it engages you, it's important to inform you about, well, it's important for you to be informed about where you're operating from. And so this quote about darkness is a call for us to pay attention to where we have invested our emotional energy. And are we villainizing, or just are saying something isn't coming from the divine? And oftentimes when that happens, it's because we've got some kind of idea in our subjective, some shadow within ourselves that we're unaware of, and therefore it filters our reactions and the ways we move through things. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that you can't have emotional reactions to things. I mean, that's what makes us human. But what makes us divine is that we can stop and be grounded in principle and remember our values and filter whatever it is we're going through from that perspective of values and principles, so that we can then engage from a place that's clear. Some of the spiritual practices that I'm going to talk about today, and we'll be looking at this kind of stuff all month as we look at the comings and goings of flow. But those practices that could really serve us right now are meditation, where we step into the silence and create space for spirit to speak through us and as us and to us. Mindfulness is another spiritual practice that can be really helpful right now. It's where we meet the moment wherever it is, without judgment, without resistance, opening ourselves to the sacred in the everyday. Mindfulness can help us to step away from our opinions and step away from our what I'll call good ideas, so that we can tap into a deeper idea of truth and where to ground ourselves in what's going on around us. And then finally, stillness. There's not a lot of stillness in the world right now. And so stillness can be a valuable spiritual practice, to just stop all motion, to let go of and stop being engaged in whatever the spin is, so that we can get in touch with that part of us that is eternal, that is deeply rooted in truth, has never been diminished. We're working with energy here, friends, and that energy is the life force that can never be destroyed. It only changes shape, and it only changes in its dimensions, but it can never be destroyed. So when we do our practices, we do them in quiet times and we do them in turbulent times. And those are the things that really help to ground us. And especially when we're doing our practice and times where there's nothing going on, those are the times that are going to fortify us. And I was reading the Science of Mind magazine this month, and in it, Dr. Raymond Anderson, has an article in it, and in that article, a reimagining of the flow of consciousness, he reminded me of that wonderful movie, The Karate Kid. And do you remember that scene in that movie where Daniel, who is the mentee, wants to learn karate, and so he goes to Mr. Miyagi to ask him if he'll teach him, and Mr. Miyagi says sure, and he has him wax his car, take the old wax off and put new wax on. He has him paint his fence, and then he has him sand floors, and then he has him paint his house. And at some point, Daniel's like, whoa, wait a minute. I came here for you to teach me karate, not to be your servant. And Mr. Miyagi looks at him and says, show me the movements that you learned doing each one of those chores. And so Daniel goes through the motions of the wax on and wax off and the painting and the different movements that he learned doing that. And then suddenly Mr. Miyagi takes a stance and begins to throw punches and kicks at him in karate style. And Daniel, without thinking, knows exactly how to block all his moves. This is what spiritual practice does for us. It is the wax on, wax off of preparing us for whatever human experience comes up, so that we can be really grounded in a deep, embodied way with who we are and the truth that we know. When I read that story, I knew that it was the perfect story to tell for today's topic and for what's going on in the world, because truly there is an opportunity for us to first dive deep in principle and to get really clear, and then to know what is ours to do. And I had a little wax on, wax off experience. It's actually wax off and then wax on experience yesterday in a mentor-mentee group. We were working with some of the material that we've been reading in this book, and we were invited to break off into little pairs. It was on Zoom, so we were in a breakout room. And I told my partner what was coming up for me, and then my friend shared what was coming up for her. And what was coming up for her was a lot of challenges around a current world leader. And so as she read that quote that I shared with you earlier in the material we were studying, what you put in darkness calls you to the darkness. What you deny, the divine in claims you in that darkness, or at least the shadow of it. She said when she read that quote, she knew that she had to put a certain world leader on her altar, to put his picture in a frame and put it on her altar, because she was denying the divine in that person. And instead, she was only focused on the darkness. And for me, that really struck me, and it kind of cracked my heart open when I heard her do that. And then this is when I had my wax off, wax on experience, because I immediately saw how my own experiences of being abused and being bullied, both as a child and a teenager, and even in the workplace and in CSL, that I have experienced, and then now in a world leader, that I have experienced that bullying as my lens, that is what I'm looking through. as I look out in the world, and I have to clean that up if I am going to be clear and transparent and engaged in the world that I want to create, in a world that works for all. And this is what spiritual practice does for us. This is what spiritual study does for us, and working in community, when we can do our work to continually get clearer and more transparent about who we are. Then it becomes the mechanism for which we greet and meet any experience. And sometimes it helps us to deal with joyous experiences and sometimes difficult experiences. My invitation to you this week is to look at your spiritual practices, to look at those places where you need to continue to do the wax on and wax off so that you can be clear, so that you can be the change you want to see in the world, and that you can have agency. Because as I said last week, there's a lot of chaos going on, and change happens on the edge of chaos. And that's where we get to impose, if you will, or affect spirit in change and have our agency about what we want to see in the world. And so we need to be clear, because if we're just putting everything in darkness, then that's what we'll be calling forth. But if we can remember these principles and we can clean up whatever it is that's in our shadow, we can walk forth from a place of transparency, and we can indeed create a world that we want to see, and a world that works for all. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that the recording didn't work today, but we have this recording, and I hope that this is helpful. I'll see you next time.